you're concerned about temperature, what matters is the total build-up of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, what we call cumulative emissions, or we use the language of a carbon budget. So we have a certain amount of CO2 we can dump in the atmosphere. So it gives us a budget to work within. And that's what matters for temperature, not some long-term target, net zero 2050, 2045, 2060. That's irrelevant. Every month, where we keep emitting like we're doing today, we use up 1% of the budget. But every year, every month, 1% of the budget, for a 50-50 chance of 1.5 we use up. That's what comes out of lying and delusion for the last 30 years. This isn't a shock. This is what comes out of what we've chosen not to do for 30 years. In a real world sense, net zero is a scam. So be very careful about climate change experts who think it can all be done with technology. But we have that potential to drive change. Us as individuals can do that. It's the rapid deployment of existing technologies. Do not rely on top-down leaders. The leaders we have today, and the two main parties in the UK, are simply ill-equipped for the job in hand. The future will be radically different from the present.
This is Kevin Anderson. He's a Professor of Climate Change at Manchester and also in Sweden and Norway, and has a fantastic amount of expertise and knowledge of this sector and speaks regularly to governments and all kinds of NGOs as well as everyday people and meetings like today. So yeah, take it away, Kevin.
Oh, thanks very much. Ooh. Can you all hear me okay at the back? Okay. Are you using the slides okay? So I've called this talk A New Denialism, which is actually the name of a chapter I wrote in a book that Greta Thunberg edited last year, the climate book. That was the chapter I wrote in there. The subtitle of this is Choosing Between a Velvet and a Violent Climate Revolution. And I'm going to try and explain why I think it's come down to that position. It is revolutionary change and the options that we may have within that. And this is based on work I've done with a number of colleagues over lots of years, and particularly Dan Calvin and Isaac Stoddard. More recently though, so anyway. I'm going to start off with this slide, which almost looks a bit flippant, but it's not meant to be. So the climate doesn't respond to good intentions, to Machiavellian policies, to eloquent arguments, legal niceties, promises of tech tomorrow, or accountancy scams. And in accountancy scams, I very much include net zero 2050. That is an ultimate accountancy scam. All of this is trumped by the brutal beauty of the physics. Now I say that, it's pretty obvious, but that's what we've tried for 30 years. So that's what we've been doing for 30 years, and it has failed. But let's not pretend that these are just little asides. This is what we've spent almost all of our effort on at a collective level anyway, certainly at the senior level, for 30 years on climate change, and the physics hasn't cared. So what is it we've committed to? So I'm going to start, so this is quite a brief talk, because I've got to condense what's in here, so if you want to ask me questions about this later, please feel free to do so. So what have we committed to? Well, I'm going to take the Paris Agreement here as the starting point, and that builds on lots of things that went on before that. And in the Paris Agreement, you're probably all quite familiar with this now, we've promised to keep well below 2 degrees centigrade of warming, ideally no more than 1.5, and these are very significant changes in the temperature that we've not seen in any modern human time. So these are, even 1.5 is a massive shift from any norms that we've seen throughout the last, well, not far off a million years. Guided by the science, and also very important here, is the basis of equity. It's embedded in every agreement going back to 1992. Every annual agreement, equity is in there, and we ignore it. Rich countries ignore it every single year. Since Paris, there's been quite a lot of data that's been gathered, and empirically we can see some of this anyway, about what are the impacts? What do they look like they're going to be at 1.5 compared to the 2? And I think it's fair to say now we're much more concerned about the impacts of 1.5. And so, in many respects, 1.5 now, I would argue, is the more appropriate threshold between acceptable and dangerous climate change. But 1.5 itself is deadly to many people around the planet. So let's not pretend it's a safe threshold. The global north may get away with it to some degree, but many people around the world will suffer severely at 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. It gets much, much worse at 2. So then, we have that as our backdrop, what we've signed up to. We've signed up to that in every agreement, including the Glasgow COP and so forth, where it reinforced 1.5. What does the science tell us, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change data, particularly from Working Group 1, that's the main science part of that, what does it tell us about the timeline that we have to address these challenges? Because I think the timeline is where we really need to be focusing much more on the near term, and I'll explain why that's the case now. What is evident from repeated science, going right way back to 2013 or so, when one of the assessment reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Assessment Report 5 came out, right way through to the latest data. It says that if you're concerned about temperature, what matters is the total build-up of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, what we call cumulative emissions, or we use the language of a carbon budget. So we have a certain amount of CO2 we can dump in the atmosphere, and that basically means a certain amount of fossil fuels that we can burn, and a certain amount of methane and other gases we can emit from agriculture. So it gives us a budget to work within, and that's what matters for temperature. Not some long-term target, net zero 2050, 2045, 2060. That's irrelevant from a temperature point of view. From a physics point of view, it's the total amount of greenhouse gases we dump in the atmosphere that matters. And the latest report, Assessment Report 6, climate change is full of jargon, unfortunately, and it's deliberately keep people out of it. So Assessment Report 6 lays out what are the size of these budgets. So if you want to stay within 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade of warming, and from 2020, it gives you a nice big range of numbers here. Billions of tons of CO2 you can put in the atmosphere, and I'll make some sense of that in a minute. So it gives us some clear idea of what size the budget is for different chances of staying within these temperatures that we've committed to. But that was from 2020, and if you update the budgets to now, then you get very, oh actually this is just last month, so I'll show you how important a month is in a minute. If you want to aim for 1.5 degrees centigrade, a flip of a coin chance, so not a good chance, and I would argue anyway that the budgets in the IPCC are actually quite optimistic. So this is the most space that we have from an emissions point of view. Then we can emit about 350 billion tonnes. That probably doesn't mean much to many of you. For 2 degrees centigrade, it's a bit more than double that. Just to give a feel for what that means, at current rates of emissions, remember emissions are going up globally every year. At current rate of emissions, if they remain static, that's 8 years of current emissions, and we blow through a 50-50 chance of 1.5, which is pretty poor chance of it. And we're about 18 years globally for 2 degrees centigrade for a reasonable to good chance of 2 degrees centigrade. If we were to reduce emissions now at a set percentage every year, that's 11% reduction every year at a global level for 1.5. At a global level, that's China, India, Rwanda, as well as the US and the UK. If you go to 2 degrees centigrade, far more impacts, much more devastating, but the rate of reduction is nearer 5%. That is still way above anything that any country has achieved. And globally, even during COVID, we didn't manage 5%. Another way to think about this is that every month, where we keep emitting like we're doing today, we use up 1% of the budget. Not every year, every month, 1% of the budget for a 50-50 chance of 1.5 we use up. And we use up about half a percent of the 2 degrees C budget every single month. So that shows how important each month is, not this 2050 rubbish that we hear normally. So if you look at that graphically, these are two plots here. You don't have to worry too much. The red one's in 2 degrees centigrade, the blue one's in 1.5. This one here is reducing at a set percentage every single year, and that's one that reduced straight lines. They've both got the same amount of carbon dioxide under the curve. The carbon budget is the same in both. But both these scores aren't very realistic, because they assume we start immediately. Now, even when the next COP is already being taken over by the oil industry anyway, that's not going to deliver anything significant. Arguably it's important we have it for some reasons, but it's not going to deliver anything significant. But let's imagine we did see something happen in the next year. It will still take another year or so to get some sort of global political agreement. We have to do something about this. Then you've got to put the technologies in place, change the social norms in our society. All that will take time, even if you pushed it really, really hard. So it's going to be a bit of a delay at the beginning. And as soon as you've got a delay at the beginning, because it's a carbon budget, the reduction rates are almost straight lines. I mean, look at that. So what's interesting from that, for 1.5, you're talking about zero emissions. That means basically zero fossil fuels by about 2040. 2040, globally. And for 2 degrees centigrade, you have a bit more, maybe early 2050s at the very outside. These are optimistic carbon budgets anyway. I mean, I think this is pretty lucky on lots of things to do with what's called climate sensitivity. But remember, in Paris, we signed up to making our commitment on the basis of equity. In other words, that the poorer countries have longer to make the transition away from fossil fuels than we do in the richer countries. And we've embedded that in every agreement, so I assume we weren't lying when we signed these things. You can make your own judgment about that. And so we followed the language of Paris, and we split the world into two parts. This is very simple, but that's the way Paris is framed in, indeed all agreements, between developed and developing countries. The UK is a developed country, desperately trying to become developing, or one thing, but we are a developed country at the moment, very wealthy, 6th richest country in the world. Developing countries covers a wide range. You've got India and China in there, and you've got Rwanda and Nigeria. So you've got a big range in there. Nevertheless, it still gives us some sort of handle of what the numbers look like. So once you split the global budget between these two areas, developed and developing countries, you get curves like this. This is what we need to be talking about, this sort of reduction level. So this is for 50-50 chance of 1.5. You know, I would, in my view, I don't know how we can deliver this. I think we can deliver 2 degrees centigrade, so we should be aiming for this still, because this means this is death for many people in the southern hemisphere and destruction of many ecosystems down the planet. So we should be trying to do everything we can for this. But just look what it means. It means by the very early 2030s, we should be zero emissions in the wealthy parts of the world. 2030. That's what, less than 10 years from now. That's what comes out of lying and delusion for the last 30 years. This isn't a shock. This is what comes out of what we've chosen not to do for 30 years. So, 2030. And it looks a bit, some people say that's a bit unfair, that blue line of the developed countries. But remember, 18% of the world's population live under the blue line. 82% live underneath the orange line. So this embeds ongoing unfairness for the poor parts of the world per person. So this is not a fair way to look at it. Basically, if we want to have any chance of 1.5, and this is a slim chance anyway, we're talking about zero fossil fuel use by 2030, 2035. The wealthy countries and the poorer countries have some leeway of 5 to 15 years, depending on where you are. 5 years in China and 15 years if you're around. So you have a bit of leeway in this. And you can then sort of say from this, well, what does this mean for the UK? So we give some guidance to the UK government what it looks like. And you get a load of numbers out of this. So you get a carbon budget for the UK, how much can the UK emit, how many fossil fuels can it burn, basically. And for 2 degrees centigrade, you've got about 8 years. For a 50% chance of 1, you've got 3 years at current levels. 3 years of current emissions will blow our fair contribution to a 50-50 chance of 1.5. If you look at the reduction rates, that's over 20% per annum for 1.5. Over 20% per annum, as an average. So, you know, poor people living in Cheetham Hill won't have to reduce as much as people in Wilmslow. Nothing like it. So there is and I'll come back to that, that's massively important. If you draw straight lines, the UK needs to be zero fossil fuel use by 2030, and a massive change in agriculture as well. So that's another important part of it. And 2039 at 2 degrees centigrade. So this is all a far cry from the net zero 2050 nonsense, which is now just taken over the language. Now, no one can talk about climate change without talking about net zero. Go back 5 years and virtually no one talks about net zero. Now everyone talks about it. Universities, the academics, the journalists, civil society. It's just nonsense. I can't go into that now, but there's some basic things I want to touch on. Net zero embeds, it's a political expedient approach that allows us to scam a lot of the numbers in the spreadsheets to make it look like actually it's science-based. It's not, it's prejudice-based, but we like to think it's science. We can describe it as science-based if we've got spreadsheets behind it. It embeds deep colonial division of the carbon budget between poorer parts of the world and wealthy parts of the world, and that is massively important. Now, all the scenarios, as far as I know, all the scenarios developed at a global level embed ongoing inequality, significant inequality, sometimes even increasing inequality between developed and developing countries. And some great work done by some Indian academics demonstrating how colonial the climate science community has been in describing these futures. It's also completely reliant on our children and our grandchildren to take these small pilot schemes that we have now, called negative emission technologies, and to deploy these at planetary scale to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Now, these things don't exist at scale. There are a few minor schemes absorbing about 1,000 tonnes here and there, but actually we emit from energy about 37 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide every year. So they're not going to play a part in the time that we have. And it also means that we can ignore the fact is that within a country like the UK, in all wealthy countries, there is a massive disparity within the countries about who emits. So those numbers I'm talking about so far are just averages, but we don't live in averages, so we have to then think about who's responsible for emissions in somewhere like the UK. This is embedded in all the IPCC scenarios and the Committee on Climate Change's balanced net zero pathway. Remember, it's a government committee, it's not an independent committee. It's set up by government, paid by government, to advise the government. There's some very good people in there, but it is deeply political. All this lot signed up to 2050 is net zero by 2050 or there or thereabouts. Yeah. Does that tell you anything about how valid net zero is by 2050? All of these oil companies are looking for more oil and gas. Every one of them. Right? All of these charlatan countries or governments they're also all looking for more oil and gas, and they're all signed up to net zero 2050 or something approximating to it. So anyone can sign up to net zero by 2050. It is totally and utterly meaningless when you get this lot signing up to it. But when you get people like the UN Secretary General, there's a great statement by him. He's actually been very strong in his statements. Today, fossil fuel producers and their enablers are still racing to expand production, knowing full well that this business model is inconsistent with human survival. Now, he's not saying everyone will be killed, but he's saying that nothing like the world in which we live today would exist. There'd be a huge, let's be brutally on that, there'd be a lot of deaths if we carry on burning the fossil fuels like we are today, and destruction of ecosystems, and all the other systemic ecological challenges that play out from that. It's not just about climate. Climate's just one small aspect of this. In a real world sense, net zero is a scam, and the sooner we start to talk about it as a scam, the better. Remember, we've got to be zero emissions fossil fuels by 2030, 2035, which tells us something about what we need to think about the election for next year. This isn't about waiting till 2030 to 2035, it means being zero by then. So basically a straight line from now till then. So it tells us a lot about what's going to be important over the next year. And currently the two main parties are basically they're both adopting the same sort of 1970s approach to this sort of stuff. So to respond to Paris, I reckon there's a two-phase approach to this. The first, and as an engineer I left it like this, you do need lots of technology. But the technology is about deployment, not about some exotic technology in the future, which just is delaying technique. It's about deploying the things that we have today, and sort of thing that Jonathan and others are involved with. We're talking about a Marshall style plan, something as big as that, like the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War, even larger than that, but without the political agenda that was there. It's the rapid deployment of existing technologies. So if we think about that, it's make existing homes efficient, retrofit. Make sure that all new homes are zero energy heating. Look at the new ones being built up the road from here. They're not anything like that. They're just, again, designed for the 1970s. Rapid rollout of public transport across all socioeconomic groups. EV charging potentially in rural environments, but I wouldn't put it in the urban environments. Some of it, but not a lot. I think the idea of owning electric cars is slightly less worse than owning petrol cars. If everyone has one privately, we have to rethink that model. A rapid shift to zero carbon electricity, massive amounts of electrification. Only 18% of the energy we consume in the UK, what we call final energy consumption, only 18%, 1/8, is actually electricity. The rest of it is basically all direct use of fossil fuels. And a deep and rapid reduction in aviation, because there's no technical way out of that. Even the aviation industry accepts that. If you go to their conferences, there's no way out of the aviation emissions at the moment without reducing demand, massively reducing demand. And for shipping, there are some technologies out there. Slow steaming makes a big difference, just going slower. I used to work on ships years ago, and we used to travel typically in a container ship then at 14 knots. This was back in the late 70s and early 80s. I did my apprenticeship in shipping, and now they're traveling at 24 knots. So, far, far more energy as a result. But responding to climate change, and a lot of my colleagues don't like me saying this, but I've not had good argument to say why this isn't valid. I think there's a win-win here for the majority in wealthy countries, let alone poor countries. Comfortable and affordable homes. We'd have to have that, because you couldn't be using gas-fired heating. So you've got to find some ways to heat the homes that people are in. Now that means less problems for the children, less asthma. That means then you've got better educational attainment for the children in those homes. Higher quality public transport, because you've got to move away from cars. So that means the urban environment around them, the air quality in those areas will be much better. So lots of people living in these sort of houses, you can go into Manchester by the university, we see them living there, crap houses, really damp, real problems for their children and for older people living there, and others as well, and really bad air quality. All of those things together. All of those things have to be responded to if you're going to deal with climate change. Secure and valued employment, because you've got to put this in place, you've got to put the renewables in place, you've got to build the transport infrastructure, you've got to retrofit all the homes. That's 10 to 20 years of fantastic high quality jobs. So better air quality, better health, better education, functioning infrastructure, improved civic well-being. Something we've been trying to erode in the UK for years now. But all of this, of course, requires moving resources and labour from the private luxury of the relative few in our society. And that relative few isn't just the billionaires, that does include people like professors. So let's not pretend that that group includes. It's not just them out there, it's often people like me. So we move towards what I think it's Monbiot used, I really like this expression, private sufficiency and public luxury. So when I cycled through Wilmslow the weekend on the way out to Cheshire, all those four-wheel drives and massive gated ghettos, none of those could exist if we had to deal with climate change. Regardless of our moral position, you can't have those and deal with climate change. It just comes out of the maths. But don't underestimate those opposing this. There's a massive opposition to this. Just think who they'll be. Huge forces. They will include the great and good, the billionaires, the CEOs, the media barons, the senior journalists, all the people in the 1 to 10%, perhaps even the 1 to 30% income earners in the UK. But that also includes, of course, many people working on climate change that are either part of the 1 to 10% or desperately aspiring to be in the 1 to 10%. So be very careful about climate change experts who think it can all be done with technology. What they mean is, I don't want to change the prestige and the wealth and the material well-being that I have had because I earn far more than the average person in the UK. That's what they really mean is the subtext. We, have a lot to lose in this. Materially, it will be a sacrifice. I mean, I would argue from a community point of view, from safety of their own children and all those other things, it's a gain. But certainly from a material point of view, this is a sacrifice. In 2023, technology is a prerequisite for 1.5 degrees centigrade. But after 30 years of failure, it is far from sufficient. We now need profound changes in our norms and values in our society. But again, these sorts of people we oppose to that. That's Mark Carney, the previous chair of the Bank of England, got paid £800,000 a year. Didn't earn it, of course. Got paid it. Wasn't a key worker, as I recall. Got paid £800,000 a year. And look, he's talking about climate change at the World Economic Forum. Can you see anything wrong with that? Discussing climate change, how we should go on that? Yeah, old white men in grey suits, that's just what we need, isn't it? So these people, of course, he wants to maintain his prestige and his lifestyle, which is incredibly high carbon. And he claims he can do it with all sorts of technologies. And guess what he's talking about here? Offsetting. There's a surprise. So regardless of your political position or your moral position, if you want to deliver on Paris, the maths is clear. 1.5 degrees centigrade plus the science tells us that equity is actually a key part of the response. There's no neat way out of that. Well, you can lie, but that's what we try to do, and that doesn't work from the climate point of view. Half the world's emissions come from 10% of the world's population. That's pretty damning in itself, but I think this is much more damning. The top 1% have lifestyles that give rise to almost twice the level of the bottom half of the world's population. Just stop and think about that in your head. The top 1% of the world have emissions that are twice as big as the bottom half of the world's population. It's almost like, can that be right? That is right, being demonstrated repeatedly time after time. A quick thought experiment on this, I thought I'd take this slide out. It's an old slide, but it's still valid, I checked it recently. Imagine we thought we were in the climate emergency. My guess is probably if we come tonight, we probably think we are, but many people don't. So. Then if we were in a climate emergency, then we require the top 10% of global emitters to reduce their carbon footprint to the level of the average European EU citizen, actually. So, not exactly, it's not going to solve the world's problems, and the EU citizen isn't deeply impoverished, I mean, it's still a reasonable level. And the rest of the world's population, the other 90%, made no change from their current emissions. That alone would be a 1/3 cut in global emissions. It just shows how the emissions are massively skewed to small groups, and there's rates of information about this now. But even the IEA produced a report this year, a commentary this year, in February, that showed this. But then Thomas Piketty and Lucas Chancellor have been doing this sort of work, Will Lamb and Julian Steinberg have been demonstrating the same thing again. The maths just tell you this sort of result. Why is equity remain taboo? Why do we never talk about equity? We talk about carbon capture and storage, geoengineering, sucking CO2 out of the air, we talk about lots of renewables, nuclear power, EVs, all this other stuff, but never equity. Well, who builds the models? Who builds the models about what we need to do about climate change? Who develops those scenarios? The politicians, the economists, the financiers, the CEOs, the professors, the modelers, the journalists, the heads of NGOs, the billionaire celebrities, all of whom are in the top 1% or clamouring to get there. So not surprisingly, the whole agenda that is normalised, the mainstream agenda around climate change, is dictated by the people who are in the top 1%. And not surprisingly, they don't want to think of equity. They're eager to sell a future of perfect green technology and carbon taxes that reinforce status quo, because of course they can afford the carbon taxes. And then by doing that, you avoid asking uncomfortable questions about power, about distribution, about fairness. So where does all of this leave us? Well, I think we're going to face, and this is a deliberately simplistic view of this, but we face revolutionary rates of change, if you like, velvet or vinyl ones. I see no way out of this now. And we've left it so late. There are no non-radical futures. The future will be radically different from the present. I've been saying this for quite a while. I think we're starting to see some of that playing out now. The choices between, and a simple way to think of this, a sort of deep, rapid and fair decarbonisation of modern society an organised-ish velvet revolution, borrowing from the breakup of Czechoslovakia, which had been a deeply authoritarian society, and actually managed to morph to something quite different, democratic structure and so forth, without lots of heads being chopped off. So it's that sort of, we could do something about it if we were serious about this. That's not going to be easy. There are lots of people who won't like this. There'll be lots of people in power we'll have to take out of power, and other people, there'll be some integrity taking over. Or we can carry on, business as usual. Ongoing lies, rhetoric, delay, and temperatures will keep going up. And what we'll have there is not sort of an organised revolution, but we'll have revolutionary scales of change that will be chaotic and violent. And they'll be chaotic and violent for everyone. The rich think they can get away with it. They may do temporarily, but they quite quickly won't. So we'll all be in this. At the same time, we're seeing ecosystem collapse for many other reasons around us as well. So to conclude, and I'm going to take a quote at Working Group 2 of the IPCC. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has one group looks at science, one group that looks at sort of impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and one that looks at what we can do about climate change, Working Group 3. I'm deeply critical of Working Group 3. I think it's part of the problem. They've been doing Exxon's job for Exxon for years, in my view now. There's some good people there, but I think it's deeply politicised. Working Group 2, I think, is interesting. And this is a response they put in their frequently asked questions. Targeting a climate-resilient, sustainable world involves fundamental changes to how society functions, including changes to underlying values, worldviews, ideologies, social structures, political economic systems, and power relationships. Well, I don't know, I can say much more than that. That captures it really well. It's all of the norms of our society are up for grabs if we're serious about climate change. So, what do I see, or where do I see change coming from? I think we look for some sort of Rooseveltian leadership in the 21st century, and I'll come back to that in a minute. You probably maybe already like that idea, but what was interesting about Roosevelt? He was trying to become leader at a very difficult time in the States, and he got 4 terms of office. 4 terms of office. He got it. So you can listen to his fireside chats, and then wireless, then the radio, when he was young. He had his chats, and the scripts are there to look at, where he sold a progressive vision of the US. Now, there are lots of problems with this. And it was very much informed by his wife, Eleanor, as well, which is always the case. No leaders work in isolation. But he built his future and his prospects in politics on the basis of vision and courage, not focus group nonsense and fear, which is sort of what we do today. But also, I think that leadership doesn't have to be top down. In fact, it won't succeed if it's top down, particularly now. I mean, even then, it would be fed by other things that we don't get to see until afterwards, really. But it's as important that it's bottom up as it is top down. What we see as top down leaders are never independent from the rest of society. They're inextricably linked. So in that, there's a real sense that we have agency to drive change, or to undermine change. In a sense, we are all catalysts for change. We don't know where that change will come out, how it will play out. We don't know that. The world is not that neat, it's much more emergent. But we have that potential to drive change. Us as individuals can do that. And more so when we come collectively with other people. So I think that this is a really important message for civil society. Do not rely on top-down leaders. The leaders we have today, from the 2 main parties in the UK, are simply ill-equipped for the job in hand. And we will not get other good members of Parliament that are no doubt there in the backbenches typically. We won't get them standing forth without engagement in civil society. So our role in making the shifts that are necessary to meet our Paris commitments is really key. Without it, we fail. So on that note, thanks so much for listening.